The annals of Jewish law extends over thousands of years. Its history can be described from a wide variety of perspectives and around several possible axes, each providing a somewhat different picture. In this paper, I intend to present an additional complementary perspective, the theological perspective, according to which the development in the field of theology found parallel expression in the field of law. Whenever there was a change in the nature of the religious experience, this change was felt in a new organization of the legal world. In a certain sense, the story of Jewish law is a reflection of the story of the Jewish perception of God and the relationship between the divine and human beings. I'm not claiming that this perspective can explain all of the changes and transitions in the history of Jewish law. I do claim, however, that it might shed interesting light on some of the main shifts that have occurred in this history. Understanding the history of Jewish law as a reflection of the history of religious experience is, in my opinion, one of the keys to understanding some of the deep currents of Jewish law. It hardly needs saying that in order to understand the history of Jewish law as a reflection of the history of religious experience, it is necessary to assume that recognition of God is not a binary matter of either full recognition or complete denial of him. Rather, this is a complex, multifaceted, and multidimensional matter. The understanding of the concept of God in the biblical literature is not similar to the understanding of the concept of God in the Mishnaic period, and they both are significantly distinct from its understanding in Maimonides' philosophy and so on. It is not only the concept of God that is a complex and developing one. It may transpire that the term religious law too is a non-binary term, one which is multifaceted and develops over time. It is important to emphasize that in discussing the relationship between law and theology, I am concentrating particularly on the correlation between the theological transition and jurisprudential transition rather than on causation. I'm not arguing that the theological developments influenced jurisprudential innovations. It is possible that the influence was in the opposite direction, and that the jurisprudential developments were later reflected in new theologies. Therefore, for my purpose, it will be enough to point out the essential correlation between these two. Of all of the different periods throughout the history of Jewish law, in this lecture, I shall focus on the transition in the Tanaitic period. The halachic legal world developed by the Tanaim beginning in the 1st century BCE is essentially different from that which preceded it in the Bible, as well as from the sectarian early halacha. According to some scholars, it is the Tanaitic period that engendered the birth of the halacha. In the phrase the birth of the halacha, I'm not referring to the birth of specific halachic rule, such as the concept of the 39 forbidden actions on the Sabbath, or the Tanaitic legal ways of marrying a woman. Rather, I mean the creation anew of the halachic system as such, the jurisprudential framework of the Tanaim, which is structurally distinct from the biblical normative system. What components distinguish the legal world of the Tanaim from the normative world that preceded them? And what is the explanation for the growth of this world of the halacha? I shall argue that an understanding of the deep change of direction in the religious experience of the sages vis-a-vis the biblical world may shed light on the deep changes in the new legal framework that they created. Parts of the picture that I will describe are well known in scholar literature, and with regard to them I will limit myself to a brief description. However, other parts of this picture have not yet been properly described and discussed in the literature, and without them, I argue, it is impossible to fully understand the jurisprudential transition that was introduced by the Tanaitic sages and its religious meaning. The attempt to present comprehensive argument concerning the transition from the biblical world to the world of the sages is liable to suffer from the defect of gross generalization. Is it really impossible to talk about biblical theology as a whole? There are, as we know, different versions of biblical monotheism, and the Torah is not uniform on this subject. The same applies to the theology of the Mishnaic sages, which is also composed of different streams and approaches. Despite all this, I believe that there is room to focus on the general characteristics of these two worlds, the Bible on the one hand and the Mishnah on the other, and to study them in juxtaposition to each other. Notwithstanding the complexity of each of these creations, they both have general characteristics by virtue of which it is possible to define the Mishnah and the Bible as works that are distinct from each other. I shall concentrate on these general characteristics below. As I've said, the Tanaim introduced a wide area of legal structures which together create a world of halacha, distinct in nature from biblical law. But before I discuss several of the central characteristics of the halachic world fashioned by the Tanaim, I would like to say a few words about the new religious experience that is the foundation for the way in which they fashioned their legal world. What is the difference between the religious experience of biblical man and that of the Mishnaic sage? In this context, many differences can be identified. Here, I wish to focus on several of them which I regard as central. One of the main characteristics of the theological change in the sage's perception is a shift from a world in which God reveals himself to a world in which God hides his face and is no longer revealed. In the biblical world, the height of the religious experience is a revelation of God to men, in forms both of prophecy and of visible miracles. The sages, on the other hand, experience a completely different world in which God's presence is hidden, and he does not show his face through prophecy or visible miracles. Indeed, the origins of the metaphor of God hiding his face is biblical. However, in the Torah, this is a temporary situation, usually a specific punishment for sins. In the sages' world, as opposed to this, God's hidden presence becomes a fixed state, and the fixed state in which they live. The sages do not, of course, deny that God's presence was once visible, and that God will reveal himself once again in the distant future, but they recognize that they live in an era in which prophecy and visible miracles no longer occur. Of course, in the world of the sages too, there are a few exceptional people who still do experience biblical type revelations of the Holy Spirit. Miracles also happen to certain sages. In general, however, the sages experience a world in which the quest for prophecy and miracles are not a part of their daily religious life. Needless to say, this shift changes the whole focus of religious life. For example, if prophecy and miracles are no longer the actual height of religious experience, alternatives are required. Hence, prayer and the study of Torah becomes a focus and the pinnacle of religious spiritual activity. The meaning of studying the Torah in the Sedish world is distinct from the biblical commandment to Torah study. In the Bible, the primary mode of studying law is by recitation of the Torah, mainly as an instrument for preservation of the laws. The idea of studying the law for intellectual purpose is not found in the Torah. In the world of the sages, however, the study of Torah becomes an academic intellectual activity, not only in order to keep the laws of the Torah, but as a religious means by itself. According to Rabbi Akiva, study is greater than practice. In other words, whereas in the biblical world, the law is an arena in which God reveals himself to man, in the world of the sages, it is a medium through the study of which man seeks to find God anew. This shift led to a dramatic change of personnel in the spiritual hierarchy of the Jewish world. In the biblical world, the central spiritual figures were the prophet and the priest. In the world of the sages, they both ceded the stage to the halachic sage, a figure unrecognized in the biblical world, who now becomes the central figure of religious life. The main power of the halachic sage lies not in receiving revelation from heaven, but rather in an intellectual study of the divine law. We can continue our description of the distinct religious experience of the Tanaitic period, but we have seen enough in order to proceed to an analysis of the parallel changes in the legal dimension. The aforementioned theological term, which intertwines the permanent hiding of God's face, the rise in the intellectual value of Torah study, and the centrality of the figure of the sage, is well reflected in parallel changes that took place in the legal world. A legal world, which the scholar is in its center, is essentially different from a legal world based on constant revelation and the centrality of the prophet. Generally speaking, the legal world created by the Tanaim is structured in a much more intellect-based way than the biblical legal world. Since these changes are well analyzed in scholarly literature, I will mention them only briefly so as to enable me to move on to my main argument. Thus, for example, whereas in the Bible the judicial process might sometimes include miracles and heavenly interventions, the sages declared that it is not found in heaven. There was no place in their legal world for biblical mechanisms such as the ordeal of the bitter water and the Urim and Tumim. The Tanaim also significantly reduced the role of heavenly punishment in criminal law, instead relying more and more on punishment at the hands of humans. While the main biblical activity in the development of the law is a revelation of God's will to the prophet, the main activity of the sages in developing the law is interpretation, based on the intellectual faculties of the sages. The place in which they operate is henceforth called the Beit HaMidrash, the house of exegesis. Whereas revelation in the Bible is always a short event that is bounded within a limited time frame, the exegetical activity of the sages is essentially of a nature that has no boundary within time or space. This intensive character of the exegetical activity explains a shift that Halbert recently termed the transition from commandments to halakha. Whereas the biblical commandments are short and laconic, through the sages' interpretations they become ramified and complex systems with many principles, details, and exceptions. This practice of the sages of analyzing the law using intellectual tools finds many additional unique expressions that are distinguishable from the biblical legal framework. The Tanaim devote much space to sorting the halachic world into categories and subcategories. They also invert great efforts in creating a detailed hierarchy of legal norms. Another aspect of the process of rationalization of the law is the rise of several new legal phenomena that are connected to the fact that henceforth there is no more revelation which can clarify the law unequivocally. Rather, the law suffers from a perpetual vagueness that derives from the nature of human intellectual activity. Thus, for example, disputes come to be one of the most distinctive features of the world of the Tanaim, a phenomenon that has no parallel in biblical law. And another phenomenon is the sage's awareness of the possibility of error in the law, a possibility that also is unknown in biblical law. Until now, we have seen the systematic aspect that stem from the fact that the sage's legal world is far more intellect-based than the biblical one. One might argue that this is not a process of shift, but rather a decline in the theological paradigm of the law. This is because all the characteristics mentioned, namely interpretation, sorting, and categorizing, dispute, error, and so on and so forth, are also characteristics of clearly secular legal systems. On this point, I would make the following argument, which does not seem to have been sufficiently addressed by scholars. The sage's awareness concerning the hidden face of God finds expression not only in diverting the center of the legal world to a more intellectual direction, but also in adding new legal religious elements that are unique to their religious world. These elements are related to the recognition that the divinity is no longer a source for revelation, but rather a source for attraction for human spiritual elevation. These legal elements distinguish the world of the sages both with regard to biblical revelation-based law and to modern non-religious legal systems. From this perspective, the elements that I will address below concretize the special religious nature of the legal world of the Tanaim. In this context, I would like to mention three systematic innovations introduced by the sages into the legal world, which in my opinion attest in the fact to the strengthening of the religious foundations of the law in their world. The first aspect is the exterritorial application of the law. From some biblical passages, it would seem that the biblical laws are intended to be observed in the land of Israel only. For example, with regard to the laws of Matzah and Chametz in Passover, the book of Exodus states, "And it will be that when the Lord takes you into the land of Canaan, you will do this act of worship in this month," etc. A similar formulation appears in the Bible regarding several other laws. This formulation expresses the underlying biblical assumption that the commandments are indeed intended to be practiced in the land of Israel only. Even if we do not go as far as that, we see at least that the Bible does not pay much attention to the question of whether the commandment should also be kept outside of the land of Israel. This underlying assumption of territorial application of the law fits well with the revelation theology of the Bible. The land of Israel is a place of God's creation. It might therefore be understood that the Torah assumes that the divine law should be kept only in the land of Israel, the land of God. The sages of the Mishnah, however, expand the application of Jewish law, extending it beyond the land of Israel. The sages distinguish between a number of exceptional commandments that are dependent on presence in the land of Israel and the majority of the commandments which apply the world over. How can this shift on the part of the sages be explained? Part of the answer relates to the fact that the sages are familiar with Jewish communities outside of the land of Israel. Yet it seems that the dramatic change in the applicability of the law calls for a deeper substantive explanation. I suggest that the expansion of the territorial application of the law beyond the land of Israel relates to the new religious meaning the sages attributed to the law. If indeed the sages see the divine law as a medium through the study and practice of which a person seeks his God, then not only there is no place to limit the applicability of the law to a specific place, but it is also extremely important to emphasize that wherever a person lives, he must learn Torah and fulfill its commandments. Just as a person needs to pray to God even if he is situated outside of the land of Israel, so he should keep God's law and study it irrespective of where he lives. In other words, in the post-revelation period, wherever man goes, God's laws go with him. In this, a surprising and not intuitive insight is brought into sharp focus. When the law is accompanied by divine revelation, it is tinged with relativity, in that it applies in the land of revelation but not outside of it. It is in fact the hiding of God's face and the different religious experience that ensues from that concealment, which give to the divine law absolute value, as a law that must be obeyed irrespective of state borders. From this perspective, the Tanaim strengthens the religious meaning of the law rather than weakening it. Another interesting jurisprudential innovation of the Tanaitic period is a two-dimensional structure of legal norms as being formed both from the outset, and after the fact, b'diavad. This distinction assumes that a certain law may have a double norm, the first as a level that must be kept ideally, and the second as a sufficient level in retrospect. This kind of distinction is not to be found in biblical law. How can the development of the distinction between from the outset and after the fact be explained in this context, and why does it characterize the world of the sages in particular? According to one explanation, this duality reflects the vagueness of the law formulated by the sages. When it is a prophet who transmits the word of God, that he transmits it in a clear-cut and decisive way. There is no room for vagueness, and therefore the law is unequivocal. As opposed to this, when the sages attempt to elucidate the law through human interpretations, they alight upon a variety of alternative interpretations, and this vagueness finds expression in the framework of the duality of the from the outset and after the fact structure. In my opinion, however, this explanation is not... Okay, this is a consumer. Yeah, this is after the fact consumer. So, looks like okay, but I'll try to continue. In my opinion, however, this explanation is not satisfactory. Even if it explains why the sages offer several possibilities for observing the law, it does not explain why these possibilities are built in a hierarchical structure, and not as two equal options to fulfill the law. In order to explain this, we must consider an explanation of different nature, recalling the different religious function of the law in a period in which God's face is hidden. In a world of revelation, where the law represents the revealed will of God, the norms represent simultaneously both the maximum to which one can aspire and the minimum that is acceptable. By contrast, in a world where God's face is hidden, the law has a completely different role. It is the medium through which man seeks to re-find his God whom he is missing. It will be useful to think about the role of the law in this world as a ladder, which man climbs through study and practice, aspiring to elevate himself towards God. Now, if the law is indeed a kind of a spiritual ladder, then one must climb rank by rank in order to elevate oneself. In this context, it is important for the law to mark not only the minimum acceptable, but also the maximum to which one should aspire, the ideal. The combination of the ideal norm and the ex post facto norm expresses the full rich religious aspiration of the sages in regard to the law. Finally, I believe that the unique religious world of the sages is evident in another context too, which concerns the scope of the contents of the law. We generally tend to think that the legal world is supposed to contain norms that were designed to be implemented. The legal world of the sages, however, includes norms that were never intended to apply, but only to be studied. On several occasions, the sages declared, with respect to certain laws, that they were never operative and never will be operative, and the entire purpose of their existence is that they will be studied. This phenomenon is different in essence from the biblical law, which creates the impression of a law that was meant to be applied and has no components that are for the purpose of study only. What are the Mishnaic assumptions concerning the law which allow for such a wide conception? In my opinion, the new religious meaning of studying the law begins to emerge here. As mentioned, in the world of the sages, the study of the Torah is a central religious value, if not the central one. Studying the law is a kind of substitute for standing at Mount Sinai and receiving the law from God. Hence, the law is intended not only for implementation, but also, and one might even say primarily, for study. This affects the structure of the legal system. From this stage on, the legal system contains not only norms that are intended to be practiced, but also norms that are intended to be studied, although they cannot be practiced by definition. To sum up, it would seem that the sages' theology of God's hidden face generated a whole different religious experience, the footprints of which could be found in their jurisprudence and the legal structures they form. The sage legal worldview is not only more intellect-based as compared to the biblical world, but it also contains new legal religious constructs. The law applies universally. The law is built as a hierarchical ladder by means of which man elevates himself. The law is also intended for studying and not only for practicing. The legal world of the sages is characterized by a religious intensity that does not fall below that of the Bible. This religiosity, however, is different in its nature, due to the different nature of a world in which God does not reveal himself, but rather man seeks God and discovers him through the interpretation of the law. Thank you very much.